You'd have to travel to a different galaxy to find any signs of intelligent life that haven't heard about Pokemon. Pokemon is the highest grossing media franchise of all time by a wide margin, over $110 billion in revenue. And it just seems like no matter what Pokemon does, they can't fail. Pokemon's a lot like me when I play chess. They just don't make blunders. Even when it's a pretty low effort product they're producing, it still sells extremely well and people lose their minds over it. You remember like last year when Oreo ran that limited time Pokemon run where like the top of Oreo cookies would have like a Pokemon printed on it? People went wacko mode. It was full-blown chaos, bodies piling in the streets, mangled corpses everywhere as everyone fought each other to get their hands on the precious Pokemon Oreo cookies because everyone was chasing those Mew cookies and selling them on eBay for hundreds and even in some cases thousands of dollars. So people went full-blown World War Z getting their hands on this, even though it was a pretty low-effort partnership. Everything Pokemon does great. They could announce tomorrow that they're releasing Pokemon branded can openers and they'd outsell lottery tickets. They'd make $1 billion overnight. People would be choosing to buy those can openers instead of buying food for their families. This shit's gotten so wild, Target had to stop carrying Pokemon cards for a while because people kept hurting each other to get their hands on the Pokemon cards and Pokemon merchandise. They just can't miss. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, in 1997, Pokemon missed so hard that it nearly canceled them right off the get-go. This is a story I remember hearing about when I was a kid, but always just kind of accepted it as like a boogeyman myth, not real, just like a legend, and never really bothered to look too deep into it until today, because I got curious. And it turns out there's a lot of truth to it, although there are some sketchy details in there that we're going to go over. But the gist of it is, on December 16th of 1997, episode 38 of the Pokemon anime aired, and physically harmed some children watching the show, triggering photosensitive epileptic seizures or like headaches, and from some things I read, even some of the kids went to the hospital. The episode's called Dino Senshi Porygon, and in this episode, Ash and the gang didn't just blast off Team Rocket, they blasted off a nationwide health crisis. Up to 12,000 people reported with symptoms of headache, breathing problems, convulsions, vomiting, photosensitive epileptic seizure-related symptoms. But what was really the full cause of everything? We're going to get into all of it here in a moment. I'm going to go ahead and quickly play a clip from a news segment that covered it back in 1997, and then go into a bit more detail on what exactly happened here. Because it's not exactly the way that it was portrayed in the media at the time. They called it Pokemon Shock, and there's quite a bit more to it there. It's like a Transformers. There's more than meets the eye. This wasn't exactly a situation where it was like The Ring, where you watch the Pokemon episode and then die 7 days later or anything, but we'll get into it in a second.
An investigation's underway in Japan into why more than 600 children suffered from convulsions and vomiting after watching a television cartoon program. It's thought that bright, flashing lights in the cartoon, Pocket Monsters, were to blame.
Almost every Japanese child knows Pocket Monsters and its star, Pakucho. They play the Nintendo computer game and were glued to the latest cartoon episode when a flashing explosion created from these slowed-down images triggered convulsions in hundreds of children. Many were kept in hospital for over 24 hours. Often those affected had no history of epilepsy. More children had fits when excerpts were replayed on the news.
Can you imagine that hell? That double whammy? You just get released from the hospital after getting hit with the cursed Pokemon episode. You go home and your grandma's got the news on and it's still playing the Porygon episode on loop. And you just get like hit all over again, just another flare-up and have to go back to the hospital, just an endless cycle. Now let's really dive in here. This was a huge deal. Like I said, I remember hearing about this growing up. This actually almost led to Pokemon being cancelled outright, and it went on a 4-month hiatus after this episode aired and all of the backlash they received from it. Which makes sense. I don't think I've ever heard of another case of a TV show physically harming its viewers. It's not like it can reach out and beat your ass. So this was a pretty unique circumstance here. It was attributed to the red and blue flashing lights that happened in the episode during the Porygon battle. The actual clip from the episode is readily available on YouTube. You can watch the entire episode, though it's not like it's vanished off the face of the earth or anything and only exists as like an old fairy tale. You can still watch it if you so choose, but I'm not going to jump scare you with it for obvious reason. So initially, this was marked up to poor animation decision here to flash red and blue lights that quickly. Apparently they're flashing at 12 flashes per second, which falls in the 10 to 20 flash category, which can trigger epileptic seizures in some people, at least based on what I was reading. However, upon further digging, there was a researcher named Ralford who really wanted to get to the bottom of how this happened, because initial reports said that like thousands of kids were getting affected by this, and it got an actual name, Pokemon Shock, because it spread so wildly, it was such a big deal. But Ralford noticed something a bit curious with it, because they said as many as 12,000 kids experienced these symptoms, but only about 1 in 100 people have epilepsy, and only 3% of those individuals have photosensitive epilepsy. So if these numbers were accurate, then the rate would be significantly higher here with these children. It'd be 10 times as many people with photosensitive epilepsy than would be expected. So the question became, did Japan have an unusually high number of children with photosensitive epilepsy, or was it something else? That was the question Benjamin Ralford aimed to answer. Not only did the numbers not make sense to Benjamin Ralford, but the timeline didn't either. The widely accepted timeline of events is as follows. Episode 38 airs in Japan December 16th, 1997. Charlie's 3 years old at the time. But in Japan, while kids are watching this episode, some of them experience photosensitive epileptic seizure-like symptoms. Headaches, breathing problems, convulsions, vomiting, all kinds of ailments from watching the show live. And this is true. There were about 600 or so reported incidents from them watching it live. However, a lot of kids watched the show the next day, or even over the next 2 days after word had already spread about the Pokemon Shock and the injuries associated with the episode. Not every case was reported on the actual live date of the episode's airing. He says, the next day I found news reports talking about how Pokemon attacks were the talk of the schoolyard. Of course they were. There were about 600 kids who genuinely did have headaches and convulsions and breathing problems, and it wasn't until 2 days later when everyone's hearing about it, everyone in the schoolyard is talking about it, that was the key, because it provided the opportunity for contagion. So what Benjamin Ralford is suggesting here is that while there was like 600 kids who genuinely did have headaches and breathing problems and all these awful symptoms, over the next few days, as that number rose to like 12,000, it's not that those kids were faking their symptoms or anything, but what they were experiencing wasn't the result of photosensitive epilepsy, it was the result of mass hysteria. Mass hysteria is defined as an outbreak of unusual and uncharacteristic behaviors, thoughts, and feelings, or health symptoms shared among a group of people. People affected by mass hysteria typically believe something specific has triggered their symptoms. So let's go ahead and take a bite out of this sandwich here. Pokemon Shock, as it was called, was talked about constantly on the news, talked about in schools, in public. Everyone was talking about this Pokemon episode that was injuring people. They were talking about the symptoms they were experiencing. They were talking about and even displaying all kinds of other ailments, all attributed to the Pokemon episode. So people started to self-produce these symptoms even with no actual photosensitive epilepsy or anything like that, because they were constantly influenced by their external sources. They kept hearing about this Pokemon episode and all of the problems it would cause, the breathing problems, convulsions, the headaches, and all that. And as they're constantly being exposed to that information, they started to feel it themselves. And it's not that they were faking these symptoms, it's not that they weren't actually experiencing them, but it wasn't because of photosensitive epilepsy. It was attributed to mass hysteria, or so Ralford concluded, as well as many other researchers who looked into it. Outside of the initial 600 or so people that presented with these problems, the additional 12,000 all had like mild symptoms that started after the initial wave, and it's mostly now regarded as a case of mass hysteria. There's also like a study where they followed 100 or so of those patients over the course of 3 years, and they never had any other epileptic episodes or anything like that. So the accepted conclusion for what actually happened was a case of mass hysteria, which is still really fucking wild. I feel like it may have been confusing to follow, and I may not have explained it super well, so just to put it all in a little nutshell here, episode 38 of Pokemon airs. While watching it live, some kids, roughly 600 or so, experience some symptoms, some of them severe enough to go to the hospital. And then it starts to be talked about by the news, the media, talked about in school, talked about in public, and they always mention like what happened and what symptoms they are experiencing. So after hearing about this Pokemon episode and all the symptoms associated with it, when some other kids went home and maybe saw the episode on the news or saw little bits and pieces of the episode elsewhere, they started to feel those symptoms themselves because they were influenced by what they were hearing externally. They self-produced the symptoms even though they don't actually have photosensitive epilepsy, thus mass hysteria. They were convinced because of everyone around them constantly talking about it and mentioning the symptoms that they were experiencing that same thing, which is why that number got so high, all the way up to like 12,000 reports. This had a really detrimental effect on Pokemon because, like I said, they were still new. They were still just getting their foothold and, becoming the juggernauts that they are today. People were very familiar with Pocket Monsters. It was Pocket Monsters at the time. It wasn't fully Pokemon. And after this happened, they took that 4-month hiatus, and their stock, it dropped pretty hard. They had a pretty rough stock time. There was talk about like Pokemon being evil. Kids shouldn't watch it. It's dangerous. And obviously parents were more concerned now with what their kids were watching because of Pokemon. So it just led to a lot of unpleasantness for Pokemon as a whole going forward. But you know how the story goes from there. They were able to regain their footing. They came back stronger than ever, and now they're the highest grossing media franchise of all time. But they came dangerously close to just eating shit because of one episode, and not even the whole episode, one small section of one episode. It really could have been the end of Pokemon, at least internationally, because keep in mind, this was 1997. Pokemon wasn't the massive hit that it is today in the West. So this was a lot of people's first time even hearing about the property. So parents were really concerned, like, oh, Pokemon's hurting children. It's going to make your kids sick and shit like that with whatever the media was saying. So it just had a really, uphill battle. But somehow it fought its way through, and now we have Pokemon at number 1 for total revenue of a media franchise. I just find this whole story to be really wild. I've never actually looked into it that deep. I'd always just thought it was either exaggerated or just never happened in the first place. But it's something that I think most people have heard of, at least in passing at some point, because it was such a big deal back then. And still, that episode and that event lives in infamy. I just thought it'd be fun to kind of revisit it and talk about it and see what was actually going on there. So, yeah, that's about it. See ya.